Welcome to The Riff, where writer and investor Byrne Hobart and I discuss the major inflection points caused by technological change. Our weekly conversation covers the obvious and not so obvious ways in which markets and businesses will adapt as a result. Let's jump right in.
Byrne, let's start with your piece on David Graeber and bullshit jobs. Why don't you unpack that idea and talk about the legacy of the idea?
Yeah. So I remember when the book came out and Graeber had written, I'd sort of instantly dismissed it because Graeber had written a book called Debt. And I first heard about debt through a really brutal review that was just pulling out a bunch of bizarre factual errors, like really not just easy to check, but like you should know this kinds of thing. So the one everyone talks about is the claim that Apple was started by ex-Microsoft engineers and they were all Republicans or something like that. Like it was like a weird claim that is just a claim about a company that is part of a narrative. Like it's just hard to avoid knowing something about the backstory there. I mean, it is true that like a lot of other early tech companies, yeah, they were founded by people who were a bit less were pretty established. If you look at early photos of, I don't know, the team at Intel or something, like you do kind of assume you're looking at a picture of a lot of registered Republicans, but Apple was a weird exception to that. And so it was like a, kind of gratuitous little mistake. Googling it would have fixed that, or just talking to someone in tech would have fixed that. So I didn't read Bullshit Jobs when it came out, and I just noticed after a while that people still mention the concept, people still talk about it, and I don't know, I thought I should give him a little bit of credit and actually read the book and see if it's any good, and it's not. It's really not good. So he does have this, he has some statistical data based on surveys where a lot of people do say they think their work is kind of meaningless, or they don't like their job very much, or they don't really understand what purpose their job serves, or if their job disappeared, they don't think the world will be that much worse off, which, okay, like maybe a large fraction of people will say that, or that's the box they tick on the survey. But I don't know how much of that you can really say is that the job doesn't make any sense versus just if you're doing a job to make some money because you have other interests and you still need to pay rent and buy groceries and things, like you just won't really think about what the like how your job connects to the rest of the world and things. It's not your main thing. And in the same way that, you probably don't spend a lot of time thinking about how, I don't know, how your body interacts with the gut bacteria and things, and like what role you serve in their ecosystem. Like if you don't really care about it, and if you don't have some sort of digestive issue that causes this to come to mind, it just may not be something that you spend much time thinking about. So that was one piece. The other piece of data gathering he had was just soliciting emails from people where they would tell him about their job and about how much they hated it and how meaningless it was. And some of those emails are pretty funny, but one of the things that I noticed in a lot of those emails is like a lot of these people are very much in Graeber's orbit. Like someone in one of them, he talks about, one of his correspondents talks about having this realization that the job was meaningless after hanging out with, like partying with a narco-syndicalist. And then he moved and lived in a squat. And there are other people where they quit their job to focus on punk rock, or to focus on academic philosophy, or to focus on writing their novels and things. And those are just not typical life paths. Like the vast majority of people who have a job they don't like very much, they either live with it and just enjoy other things about their life, or they eventually switch to a job that's more satisfying. But if you have a cohort of people who are all going to take really unusual life paths, it's not surprising that they would have kind of unusual beliefs. And there is this tendency sometimes to look at a phenomenon and describe it through broad survey data, and then to highlight examples of it that are just not representative. And then you sort of connect those non-representative examples to this big aggregate thing, and then it looks like it's a huge problem when it's actually a fairly unremarkable thing that has problematic individual cases. In the early 2000s, when a bunch of Wall Street banks got in trouble for their investment research, there were basically two pieces of this. One of which was there were a couple cases where analysts did like clearly unethical things. The most famous one, and also just the funniest one, was there was an analyst who covered large telecom companies. I think he upgraded AT&T, I believe, because he wanted to get one of his kids into an extremely exclusive preschool, and there was an AT&T executive on the admissions committee And so he realized that if he did a favor for AT&T, then his kid would get into the school. Like that's a pretty, that is clearly unethical. That's clearly abusing his privilege and, misleading the market, et cetera. But then the fine that the banks paid was not based on what is the impact of one bogus upgrade for AT&T and what is the impact of analysts at Merrill Lynch saying that the companies that they're talking about are not very good, but still putting buy ratings on them. Like that stuff is not good, but it's also not a big part of the overall equity research world. And the fine ended up being billions of dollars. I believe it was like a billion plus settlement. So it was a $1.4 billion settlement. And $1.4 billion was probably on the order of 10 or 20% of investment bank research revenue in the relevant time frame, something like that. So like that number makes more sense if you peg it to this very, very large number that is mostly people doing just pretty reasonable things, like looking at an oil stock that trades at a slightly lower multiple than other oil stocks and saying this one is a buy because the stock is kind of cheap. So you can do that trick sometimes where you take stories that make something really salient and then you take statistics that make it look ubiquitous, and you don't spend much time considering how well the stories connect to the statistics. And so Graeber, through massaging some of his numbers, he gets to this calculation that slightly more than half of all economic activity consists of bullshit jobs. And that just isn't true. So one of my counterpoints to this is, if that's true, wouldn't private equity firms be really, really excited by this? Like, wouldn't they just be buying every company they could and firing half the employees? Like, where are all the companies where half the employees go away and the company still works? And of course, what people bring up there is Twitter, where it's more than half, and it does still work. Like, yeah, there are more errors than there used to be, but it still works fine. They still ship new stuff. But Twitter was also just notorious as a company that had a lot of extra headcount and did not execute as well as many of its peers. So you again have a case where there is a compelling story, but that story is clearly non-representative of the broader phenomenon. So it doesn't really demonstrate that broader phenomenon is true. But the really meta point that I kept coming back to when reading the Graeber book was he's just not curious. He's just not interested. Like, he's an anthropologist. He's supposed to be studying people. He doesn't really have interest in what people do with the majority, with the plurality or even majority of their waking hours. And he doesn't have any interest in connecting that to the needs of other people, except to say that these needs either aren't real or aren't legitimate needs. And I think anyone can just say that a huge amount of economic activity produces things that they personally would not be interested in buying. And therefore it's superfluous and we need to revolutionize society so that people still do 100% of the economic activity that is useful to me, but 0% of the economic activity that is useful to people with different preferences from me. But I think there's this healthy detente that we've reached as a civilization where we say it is just going to be the case that other people will have interests that are different from yours, and that we are all pretty much better off if we can satisfy those interests and produce things that people value, even if we don't particularly value those things, even if the context in which those things actually provide value to the rest of the world is extremely opaque and complicated. But also, given that we have such a system, you can actually start just teasing through little details and trying to figure out what purpose do these jobs serve? Like, why has this person whose job doesn't make any sense? Why have they not gotten fired? A surprising number of Graeber's anecdotes, they can be traced back to either government regulations or union rules, which are then supported by government protections for unions. And I think that's very different from his political agenda. Although, he was an anarchist, so he may have, in some sense, felt a similar kind of skepticism towards unions and towards large governments that he felt toward large companies. But in the book, he spends a lot of time pinning the blame on capitalism, on governments, and for as a callback to the debt stuff, that there are a lot of factual errors. Some of them are they're kind of minor things that people do rhetorically if they're not super familiar with the data. So at one point he's talking about inequality, and he says that, of course, the rich determine a lot of our priorities because they have, I think he phrases it as more than half. He phrases it in such a way that he wildly overestimates inequality because the stats he's actually quoting are for wealth inequality. And the rich, being rich means having accumulated wealth. So it is cumulative income less expenditures. So that's one issue with it. And the other issue is the rich have a very low marginal propensity to spend, like a very, very low marginal propensity to spend. So they are having an effect on consumption because they do individually spend a lot of money, but a lot more money gets spent by just middle class people and below. So a lot more of the preferences that you see expressed in the consumer economy are actually the preferences of middle class people who just have a whole lot more spending power in the US than the very, very rich. Like the rich could be spending a whole lot more, but one of the reasons that people get really rich is that if they have $100 million, rather than enjoying all the things you can enjoy with your $100 million and never working again, they figure out how they can get that number up to $1 billion. And then at $1 billion, they make the same calculation. Like that's why they're rich, is they are reinvesting, not spending. That might be pathological. It might be some weird mental flaw, but it is also a fact that is just how they operate. And so it means that their spending behavior just doesn't have that big an effect on the economy. And then there were other just totally random errors, like he has a bad etymology for the word sheriff. He thinks it comes from Arabic. It actually comes from Anglo-Saxon. You can Google this. I only noticed that because I remember stumbling on some reference to the fact that the word sheriff comes from the word shire reeve, and sheriff always had this Old West connotation to me. And so the fact that Bilbo would have known a shire reeve was just really appealing to me. So that fact stuck with me, and facts do not stick with Graeber in the same way.
Speaking of etymology, I'll never forget that in 2020, I tweeted something along the lines of, meritocracy, one of these tweets that was like, we've given up on meritocracy, this kind of thing. And then people jumped in to say, hey, meritocracy was always a bad idea. Like it was invented to be a joke. This is timely with sort of the MEI meritocracy, Alexander Wang stuff recently, and it coming back into fashion. But people jumped on it, including Matt Iglesias. And you had a tweet that was something like this: meritocracy. The word meritocracy is like the game of Monopoly, invented by socialists to critique capitalism, but slightly tweaked and far better marketed by capitalists. It's hard to outrun the profit motive when you can't control the IP.
There we go. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. Like the meritocracy thing is interesting. And actually, the original critique of meritocracy was pretty good. It was that it's basically, I guess we could cite a different anarchist thinker who I do actually like. Seeing like a state talks about this stuff all the time, that if you take domain of human endeavor and you try to measure to try to rank people, you're inevitably going to rank them on the things that are easy to measure. You're just not going to be able to rank them on the qualitative things. Or if you do, you end up creating this politicized sidecar thing. Like, universities actually do this all the time, where they try, sometimes they care about things like standardized tests, GPA, other measures of academic achievement. And then they also care about your personality. But it turns out that it's actually a lot easier to optimize for having the right personality, having the right outside interests. Like that stuff is easier to fake than getting a perfect score on the SAT. That's a lot harder to fake. So it actually ends up being a less merit-driven system as you broaden the definition of merit, because you create this newer incentive to game the results. And I think that's also just arguments from word origins are just not that intellectually strong. Like if the fact that propaganda originally had a more positive connotation, the word nice used to mean stupid. But that doesn't have anything to do with how we use those words today. I am more of a prescriptivist than a descriptivist linguistically, but I also think that you basically want to draw the line at English usage as of the advent of mass literacy is standard English. You can add words to it. You might be able to tweak things a little bit, but in general, you should try to speak in such a way that a 19th century reader would be able to comprehend what you're saying, because that means that you actually have more fluency with just a larger set of written culture, of English language culture, if you are really speaking in and even thinking in the same language as most of the people who wrote most of the ideas that influenced or caused or are the ideas that you have today. So I think you can pay some attention to that, some attention to those technicalities. I still tend to treat the word media as plural, so the media are, not the media is. But if you always reify what is the original oldest meaning, one problem is you will tend to stick to whatever meaning best serves your goals. So in Graeber's case, he wants to have this story where Western Europe encountered much more advanced civilizations outside of Europe, and they took some of those ideas and then forgot that those were borrowed ideas. But what I think is a more interesting story is actually there's been this crazy convergent evolution where, people when the Spanish first came to what is now Mexico, I guess what was then basically Mexico, when they came there, they were subsidized by a monarch, and that monarch was affiliated with religious authorities who gave him legitimacy. And they came to this other continent that had had no contact with Western Europe or with Asia or with other groups for millennia. And they found a monarch whose power was very much bolstered by the local clergy. So like, I think that is actually a more interesting story where there is this convergent evolution. And when you find populations that have been uncontacted for a while, that they have independently stumbled on some of the same institutions, some of the same ways of scaling humans. I think that is more fun than the idea that some of these discoveries happen just once. And then if you use the same institution or even use a word for something that sounds like the word that someone else used for a similar kind of thing, that it must mean you got it from them. And it is also true that, at the point in history where there were both sharifs and shire reeves, that standards of living were higher in the non-Western world, and they were able to sustain a more complex civilization. But those things, they're somewhat cyclical. The cycle quickly shifted.
Hey everybody, Erik here with a word from our sponsors. Fast forward to the end of 2024. Think about your goals. What can you do right now to give yourself the best chance of succeeding? If learning a new language is on your list, you absolutely need to check out Babbel. Babbel offers a range of learning tools, self-study app lessons, live classes, and even podcasts, which have always been my favorite way to learn. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel isn't just a game to kill time and make you feel like you're learning a language. It's not overly academic or rigid either. It's all about learning language for the real world. Babbel stands out because it's designed by real people using a modern conversational teaching approach. It's not always easy, nothing worth doing ever is, but it's straightforward and designed to help you start speaking in just 3 weeks. With Babbel, I was able to brush up on my intermediate Spanish to ramp up for travel to Argentina last year, and was able to set clear goals based on how much time each week I wanted to practice. Join millions of Babbel language learners across all age groups. Here's a special limited time offer for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners, at babbel.com/zen. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/zen, spelled BABBEL.com/zen. Rules and restrictions may apply. If you don't already subscribe to Turpentine's industry-leading newsletters, like our new daily AI newsletter, Emergent Behavior, or Media Empires, you should. But that's not what I'm here to tell you about. The platform we use to power these newsletters is called Beehiiv, and it's excellent. First of all, it was started by the same early team who helped build Morning Brew into a $75 million newsletter business, and they built Beehiiv to offer that same powerful functionality to anyone sending emails. From essayists to business owners, the platform is beautiful, their text editor is intuitive, and they help you scale your audience with custom growth features. Beehiiv has powerful tools to help you monetize your content. You can easily launch paid subscriptions or pursue an advertising model. The Beehiiv platform will even connect you to premium brands to sponsor your newsletter. Not only do we use them, but thousands of the top newsletters in the world also use them, like Milk Road, Blockworks, the Lindy newsletter, and so many more. Beehiiv's founder hooked up Moment of Zen listeners with a sweet deal. Get 20% off for 3 months with code MOZ. Visit beehiiv.com, that's BEEHIIV.com, to get started.
It is interesting. There's this trend, or there's a sort of a series of people who write these mega books that do put a lot of work and a lot of research, and they're often smart and high IQ, but they're just kind of like hacks. Like, I don't know, like Piketty, I think we talked about it a long time ago, or Krugman to some degree, Chomsky maybe, it's funny because they're full-time thinkers and they have a wealth of knowledge, but the methodology if the conclusion is always fixed, which is like support their side, and there's some on the right too. I don't mean to just make it on the left, but it's interesting to just watch these kind of in action.
Yeah, there was actually a really good Scholars Stage post about this, where he talks about the life cycle of a public intellectual, which is in his model, I think it goes roughly like this. So you're an academic, you write your first book, and it's about your extremely narrow specialty, Indonesian peasant blacksmithing practices in the early modern period or whatever. And then that book does surprisingly well, and you become surprisingly well known, and you write some general interest book that is still, it's more general interest. It's still about your specialty, but it's a bit of a broader one. So it's like, here is what Indonesian craftspeople have contributed to the rest of the world. And you do have a lot of knowledge about this. So you're able to give people a bunch of surprises. You probably do throw in some fun etymologies, and you probably do have just some cool little details that nobody else had because people haven't been diving into the source material as much. And if that book does sufficiently well, then you end up with this problem, which is your next book is going to be the book that is just your theory of everything. And you have to somehow take your, world-leading expert knowledge on this one really narrow domain and your massively above average knowledge on this broader domain, and then try to apply it to everything else. And you end up either writing a book that is just platitudes or writing a book that is just like everything can be explained through early modern blacksmithing practices in Indonesia, or you end up doing, some weird combination of those. But it is also true that there is value in these really broad books that try to take a useful model that hasn't been articulated or hasn't been articulated that way before, hasn't been applied broadly. You apply it to as many things as possible, and then you look at what falls out. And I think like Nate Silver's, his book, Signal and the Noise, actually did this really, really well with Bayesian statistics, where it's just like problem after problem. You look at that problem and there is a really good framing for understanding both how to make predictions and how to understand the limits of your predictive ability. And it does apply across a lot of domains. And you can even imagine those books performing a sort of public service of informing people that there is this network of similar thinkers that they are actually part of, but they were not aware that the full network existed. And so you can hopefully induce some kind of cross-fertilization between these different disciplines. And I think that there's a lot of value in that kind of thing. And I'm going to be very hesitant to complain about people writing nonfiction works that cover a lot of different topics at once and try to advance some kind of agenda, because I did that. I wrote a book that does fit that mold, coming out in October, wherever books are sold. So the hyping will only escalate from here. But so I have done that. It's, maybe it's a vice, but it's a vice I'm not especially ashamed to have. And maybe it does speak to just some intrinsic difficulties with trying to understand the world, that you can understand narrow things really, really well. Like you can pretty much, no matter who you are, you can choose a specialization narrow enough that you can be the world's leading expert on it. And if you do that, you will probably come up with some ideas that have more applicability. And then you have a lot of uncertainty in trying to figure out, did you accidentally stumble on this rich vein of insights that can be mined and then, the output can be used everywhere? Or is it just the case that you have a hammer, everything looks like a nail, and that there are, thousands of other people who have other slightly different tools, and they all have exactly the same kind of cognitive bias that you do? So Graeber, he is ideologically an anarchist. He wants to see the current system as being just absurd and oppressive. And so he finds lots of examples, in part because he went looking for them. And I think he found enough examples that he was getting just this constant drip of confirmation bias. But I suspect that if I put up a Gmail account and I said, send me, whoever you are, wherever you are, send me your stories of how fulfilling it is to optimize either financial transactions or ad targeting. Tell me about how satisfying that is. I bet I could get a similar number of people who are just really anxious to say that they actually enjoy it. It's a fun puzzle. It's very competitive. They get to use all that math that they learned in school that they thought would be useless. They like their friends. They do feel like market liquidity or like matching consumers to the products that will bring them happiness, that those are legitimately useful tasks. The world would be impoverished in some way if they weren't doing them and weren't working as hard. I'm sure I could find plenty of people who say that. And I think that is about as meaningful as Graeber's sample. So I would hope that if I did that, I would not assume this means everyone is just really, really jazzed to make ads slightly better targeted. I would probably just assume that, you can find a lot of people who feel that way, because the world is full of a lot of people with a lot of different priorities. And sometimes those priorities are expressed in work. Sometimes those priorities are in tension with the work that they do, but we all kind of muddle through. And GDP per capita does rise gradually over time. So we're muddling through in a pretty good way.
I do wonder if Graeber were still alive over the next few years, if he would see himself as validated on his bullshit jobs in terms of what AI is going to do. We talked about this a little bit with therapists and engineers the other day, though I wonder anytime people say there are going to be more of them, I wonder kind of at what wage level it's going to be higher or lower. But I think the broader idea someone is making this comparison of like, hey, our economy used to be, we used to have a lot more farmers, and then sort of due to technological advancements, the number of farmers reduced dramatically, and humans found other stuff to do. And if you think that's going to look pretty similar in terms of like, hey, the economy, we have a lot of knowledge workers, and we're going to have fewer knowledge workers, or at least at the same wages, and people are going to find other things to do, like coaching or whatever, other things that are a bit more human touch. Flash forwarding a few decades, what do you think that story is the contours of that story is going to be like?
So I would have a wide range of outcomes in mind, because on the one hand, human beings have brains, eyes, ears, hands. We have a lot of very useful tools that can be applied to farming, definitely, but also to factory work and also to knowledge work. But we don't always have the greatest relative advantage in all of those tasks. So there were plenty of jobs that got eliminated in earlier technology cycles when we domesticated some animals and realized that some of them are actually better for pulling plows, for example, than we are, or much better at hauling goods for long distances than we are, or that, it's probably easier to have a long distance communications network with horses, where you have like a relay system where messages are passed by horses. This, by the way, is another one of those things that like relay systems for transmitting official messages across long distances did actually exist in both pre-Columbian exchange in the Andes. I believe they had I think they had a system where there were just runners who were trained very good at high altitude running, and if there was an important message, they would just pass it from runner to runner to runner. So you basically get that message moving at the speed of a fast runner. The Mongols had a similar setup, and then the US at one point had the Pony Express, kind of similar concept. So like that kind of thing does get invented many times as another callback. But anyway, there are some tasks where we just no longer have the comparative advantage. Things like lifting heavy objects, applying a lot of force in a controlled way is generally something that you do with a machine and not a person. And there are other things where we still have a comparative advantage, especially things where you need very tight feedback between the motor and a sensor that's controlling exactly what that motor does. So human beings, the product suite of eyes, brain, and hands is really, really helpful in a lot of manufacturing contexts. So it's been hard to automate some of that stuff away. But then for a lot of thinking driven tasks and memory driven tasks, we have been automated away. So we don't need someone, for example, who has just memorized the entire history of our country and can recite it just offhand. Now we just write that stuff down. And so we can write a lot more of it, but we do have fewer people who are in that profession of just memorizing. In that case, it did create more jobs. Like there are definitely more people working in the study of history than there were back when history was something where you couldn't write it down because you were illiterate, but you did have to know it. And then there are potentially some jobs that just go away, and the people who did those jobs don't have skills that directly apply to the next job after that. So it is something to worry about, especially things like, a lot of jobs are some form of logistics, and you've got stuff like truckers where it does make a lot of sense in the long run for that to be automated. Delivery drivers, it makes sense in part just because, and this is something that basically everyone with a drone delivery company will use a basically similar line, that you really don't want a 200-pound person driving a 2,000-pound car to deliver a 1-pound burrito somewhere. Like, why not have a small lightweight drone that is not actually controlled by a full-time human pilot, delivering the same thing and using a lot less energy and taking less space on the road and just demanding less human attention? So if we eliminate enough of those jobs, I'm not sure what the workers end up retraining to do. It has generally been a safe bet that they will find something to do, that standards of living do tend to rise after technological transitions, but also that there is typically a lumpy period where actually that automation can depress unemployment. So you can, like, for the Great Depression, one of the important stories was just there were these global imbalances. You had different countries that were either accumulating or spending down currency. You had a lot of tariff barriers that were just making the economy less efficient and creating all these tensions. And then you have other geopolitical tensions that also just made things difficult. But you also had this rise in efficiency. So that was the period where a lot of factory electrification really, really took off. That was the period where the truck as a new technology had been deployed. And so trucks ended up making it more efficient to transport things by rail, because you transport it by rail and then the truck takes it from where the train stops to where the customer is, or to an intermediate warehouse, et cetera. And that just reduced the need for a lot of jobs. It meant that the number of ton miles that a single person could be responsible for went way up. And so you needed fewer people hauling things around. And so I think that was probably a factor in the length and severity of the Great Depression. You have this coincident thing where net worth of very rich people dropped significantly because stock prices went down and a lot of them were levered, but also there were more domestic appliances. So I suspect that one of the things that happened in the 1930s was people saying, well, we can't really afford to have 2 maids and a nanny, but we can't afford this washing machine. And, our standard of living was actually higher with lots of domestic labor, but given that we can't afford that, this is actually a viable alternative. So you could see something like that happen. I think that policymakers have a different attitude towards those kinds of slowdowns than they did in certainly the early stages of the Great Depression. So we could imagine that there would be sufficient government spending to offset that, but it would be in very much uncharted macro territory if, say, the US government is persistently running deficits that are 10 to 20% of GDP to support either very large UBI or just lots of make work jobs. I'm sure Graeber would have ambiguous feelings about all of this. We escaped capitalism, but at what cost? So, yeah, I think that anyone who's really, really confident that yes, unemployment will spike and stay high forever and people will be starving in the streets, that's probably wrong. Anyone who says, no, actually 5% unemployment is just the number around which economies fluctuate forever, also wrong, has been true for a very long time, but it has been true for specific reasons, specific circumstances. Those circumstances don't always hold. And so you just can't extrapolate that far.
That makes sense as a explanation. I want to shift to another topic that you wrote about, sort of the separation between voting rights and economics, which has been a popular topic in a variety of different contexts. Why don't you unpack your thoughts there?
Yeah, sure. So the 2 stories that I wrote about this morning that both touch on this were, 1, the partial sale of Paramount, and 2, there was an corporate activist struggle with a company called, Massimo. So there's a company called Massimo. They had a shareholder vote related to something that corporate action, I think, to take over. And there was a brokerage whose customers collectively owned less than 10% of the shares outstanding, but somehow 9.9% of the shares outstanding were voted in favor of one side by that broker. And there was also, right around that time, a rise in the cost of borrowing shares of that company. And so the strong suspicion that the hedge fund running the activist campaign had was this broker did someone a favor and borrowed a bunch of stock with the specific intent of voting a particular way. And then the Paramount deal has a similar dynamic where Paramount has voting and non-voting stock. It's like a lot of media companies. There's a controlling family that own less than half of the economic interest in the business, but much more than half of the voting rights. So they are in charge for as long as they choose to be, unless the company literally goes bankrupt. And when in that deal, they got those super voting shares got a 53% premium to what the non-voting shares got. And even that actually kind of overstates things. So the structure of the deal is kind of complicated, but the basic idea is that the company, the family-owned holding company that controls these shares, gets bought out. The shares that are not owned by that company also get bought out. And the buyer buys some shares directly from Paramount so that the company has more cash, and then buys other shares from outside investors and is buying them at a premium to the current market price. So those investors will offer to sell. They will get prorated. So, if people sell, the company's offered to buy X shares and people offer to sell 2X shares, you get to sell half your shares at this premium price. The other half you keep the low price. It's just this illustration that there is value in controlling a company. That value is separate from the present value of future cash flows. Often the valuation gap is just not that big. So it's usually the case that voting shares are just much less liquid. If they trade at all, they will, in some cases, they just trade at a persistent discount because it's hard to buy or sell a large amount of them at once. And then occasionally they trade at a large premium, not because people have changed their mind about liquidity, but because they're placing some positive value on. And of course, it makes sense that they would sometimes trade at a premium, because why would you create dual class stock unless you personally valued your continuing control of the company? So of course those shareholders do care about that. And of course they are going to act rationally, but it does create this kind of awkward situation where you can vote more shares than you own, or you can effectively disenfranchise, like proportionally disenfranchise other shareholders. But I think this also raises the question of why are we particularly linking control of a company to just common shareholders? Because many companies have a more complicated capital structure than that. Bondholders don't get a vote. Lenders don't get a vote. Employees don't get a vote. It's customers, suppliers don't get a vote. It is. And what's also kind of surprising is that this system has actually worked really well. Like, it does seem to be the case that if the default arrangement is that common stock represents proportionate ownership in whatever profits a company makes, like whatever money is left over after the company has paid off all of their obligations. And if the owners of those units have voting power proportionate to their economic interest, that has tended to lead to pretty good corporate governance. It's tended to lead to a system where stocks mostly go up over time, where the US market has outperformed other markets, where people in poorer countries still allocate capital to the United States because there are just lots of investment opportunities here. So it works really well. And it's kind of surprising that it did. It may be one of those cases where it's kind of an arbitrary rule. Like, you could imagine a different standard that's something like employees get 25% of the votes, and then suppliers to the company and customers get another 25%. And then the rest is split, where for every, for your bonds, you get like 1/10 the voting power, because most of the time you're just not making decisions that usually matter to the company's creditworthiness. Sometimes they do. In practice, we do have a system where the effective control is not directly tied to votes. In part, it's just really hard to get people to vote, especially for pretty marginal changes. And so you do have a system where those other entities do have power. So employees, for example, can quit, or they can ask for raises, they can complain. They do have some latitude there. Suppliers and customers can also boycott, decline to do business with someone, only do business at a different price, etc. And then lenders have either no control the vast majority of the time, or pretty much absolute control if the company can't actually pay them back at the terms that they expected. So we do, when we're looking at situations like one share, one vote, that is a snapshot of one subset, like one kind of formal control at one particular point in time. It's not the full picture and doesn't tell you everything you need to know. And so even within that, the extra complications, I think they just make sense in light of the fact that corporate control is sometimes pretty ambiguous. This is something that we've written some wonderful things about, because there are some cases where there will actually be a dispute within a company about who's in charge. And you can have cases where, for example, one person owns the Twitter account and has access to the PR Newswire account. And so they put out a press release saying we're in control. And then someone else has access to some other means of communication that says, no, you're absolutely not in control. We actually fired you last week. And Chinese companies in the 90s, there are some great stories in the book, Mr. China, about how, in effect, corporate control meant that you were in physical possession of the company seal, which could be used to sign official documents. If you had the seal, you were the boss. And if you used that seal to wire all of the company's cash on hand to an account that you controlled in Hong Kong, and then you left and just stopped answering calls from the shareholders of the company, then that is just what happened. The person who controlled the company decided that the best thing to do with his assets was to send them to that bank account, and that's it. And from what I understand, corporate governance has gotten a bit better in, around the world since those days. But you still have these ambiguities. You still have cases where the formal system works until there is some kind of crisis, and then informal systems to take over.
Another thing you wrote about, you quoted Max Tabarrok's argument against the burden of knowledge. I'm curious if you can unpack his view, but I also, you've written before about sort of this question around why is progress stalled in certain fields? Is it because we've just picked the low-hanging fruit, or for cultural reasons or structural reasons? I'm curious if you could share more about that as well.
Sure. Yeah. So the burden of knowledge argument, very quickly, is this idea that as a field makes progress, there is simply more to know, which means you have to spend more time studying it before you get to the frontiers. My favorite example of this is there's an anecdote in one of the books about the development of the transistor that talks about how in the 1930s, if you were a physics PhD student, when you got the new textbooks that semester, if you read them before anyone else, you would actually know more physics than your professor. It was changing that fast. And it was changing fast at the level that would be now, just past undergrad. So, but now you probably can't learn more physics than your professor if you are a first year PhD student, unless you're really, really good or your professor really not. So it's just harder to get to the point where you can make meaningful contributions to the field. And to the extent that making contributions relies partly on that crystallized intelligence, partly on accumulating enough basic knowledge, and then partly on fluid intelligence, just how fast does your brain run? Fluid intelligence peaks disturbingly early in life, like mid-20s typically, and then just declines forever, which is distressing. So I'm no longer in my mid-20s. I remember like the first time I read about that, I was like, this is great. I'm only going to get smarter until some indefinite point in the distant future when I'm the ancient age of 25. And surely by then I will have figured everything out. It didn't quite happen that way. Anyhow, the counter argument is good and interesting. He claims that in many cases, we develop more advanced theories that just allow us to memorize less stuff. That instead of enumerating all of the examples of some phenomena we don't understand, we just have a simple theory that explains what we do understand and explains all of these different observations. So, pretty classic example would be heliocentric versus geocentric models, where a geocentric model can work. You just have to memorize a lot of different epicycles and epicycles within epicycles, and eventually you can make things tie out. You can make the firmament move as if it is just a large sphere that is slightly outside of the Earth, but it's just a whole lot easier to explain things with gravity. And my counter argument to that is, if you just tell people what gravity is, it's not like they can actually deduce all of the consequences. They might be able to deduce a lot of them, but you still need some handholding. And often what you actually need is to take a set of observations, be confused about them for a while, and then gravity becomes this skeleton key that tells you, okay, here is why the moon does this, the Earth does that, and an apple falls from a tree. And they're all part of the same phenomenon. So I'm not entirely confident that there are that many theories where you just give someone the theory and they're instantly able to apply it everywhere. Like, it'd be nice if that were the case. You could teach being a physics major could be just on the first day of class, someone gives you a list of physical constants and a list of physical laws, and then you just think for a while and deduce all of existence from that. But you generally can't. You generally have to look at a lot of examples, look at a lot of confusing edge cases, take a simplified model, and then just push it to its limits, whether those limits are observations that don't line up with the physical model, or whether they are theoretical questions that convince you that this model actually has kind of wobbly underpinnings. Either way, it just takes a lot of time to do that. And there are just more such theories to know and more such theories to internalize. So I don't think that they hugely decrease the burden of knowledge. I think that they slightly compress things, but I also just think that there just aren't that many people who can take the basic premises of some academic field and deduce the entirety of that field. And in fact, you can look back, one of my favorite examples of this is that Boole figured out he figured out interesting, useful ways to formalize various logical operations. And if you've done that, if you've written out the little truth table for not and, then you can actually go from here is not and to pretty much here is a working computer. There's a book called, I think, Elements of Computing Systems that does this. You also need a clock to synchronize operation. But if you either have that, or if you assume that the operations are synchronized anyway, then you can deduce things like, you can deduce memory and a CPU, and then low-level operating system, and then a programming language, and then anything you could implement from that. You can deduce all of that from taking a NAND gate and then considering the other kinds of logical operations you can build with it. It's a fun thing to work through. These go through the first couple chapters, because you can go from NAND gates to here is the design for a simple chip that you could physically build if you truly felt like it. And this chip can do addition and a couple other mathematical operations, actually a bunch of mathematical operations. So that's pretty cool, but it also took a really long time to go. It wasn't like Boole came up with this and then a week later someone had invented JavaScript as a theoretical construct. No, we actually needed to build computers, realize that the formalism would work for describing how computers operated, use that formalism to come up with ideas for other things computers could do, use those computers, figure out what else we wanted to do with them, and so on. We kept kind of bouncing back and forth between theory and application. And now we can speedrun it. You can do 100+ years of the development of computing theory in a fairly short time frame if you are determined to do it. But also a lot of people are not that determined to do it. Like I gave up part of the way through elements of computing systems, although I do intend to revisit it at some point. And I think that's probably true of a lot of other fields. So I still think the burden of knowledge exists, but it is compelling to think that the burden of knowledge, like the burden of knowledge to get to being cutting edge informed about a given subject circa 2024, that should get easier and easier over time as we figure out more of the meta rules, more of the abstractions, and as we just get better at teaching it, or, as people write really, really good textbooks that everyone keeps reading for a long time. So the burden of knowledge for knowing a field as of a certain year is going to continuously diminish, but the burden of knowledge for can you contribute meaningfully in the current year, I think that keeps going up.
Can you say more about the Robert Gordon thesis in terms of what you think he gets right or doesn't get right, or the broader sort of conversation surrounding the topic?
Yeah. So Gordon, his big thesis, the rise and fall of American growth, is that we had this period of above normal productivity growth that roughly petered out in the 70s, and that you can trace it to a handful of meaningful inventions, things like electricity and internal combustion engine, that just drove a lot of productivity growth for a very long time. That they were big enough inventions with broad enough applications that it took us a really long time to both figure out all the applications and then figure out all the second order consequences. Classic second order consequence of ubiquitous internal combustion engines is that it made sense to build larger supermarkets with cheaper food, because if people are walking to a store to buy their groceries, they're probably buying them pretty much every day, and they're probably buying things with a short shelf life. They're probably buying a small amount at a time, so you have a lot of small transactions. If they all have cars, the cars all have trunks, and people like to drive, then they can do once or twice a week a really big shopping trip, buy a ton of stuff. And if that grocery store is catering to a larger set of customers, because people are traveling from larger distances to go there, and it is selling more stuff in each transaction, it just has much, much better unit economics. So you end up with bigger grocery stores that actually have wider selections and that sell cheaper stuff. Everybody wins, except the people operating the small local grocery stores. My grandfather had one of those, and he apparently was introduced to people who were building a chain of supermarkets in St. Louis in the early days of supermarkets, and thought the idea was kind of bogus. He managed to hang on and, eventually sold the building and retired. But yeah, those smaller grocery stores did just get crushed by this. But that's the kind of thing where if you were experimenting with the first internal combustion engine, you would not be thinking about how will this change grocery shopping 100 years from now. You were thinking about how do we make this go faster and how do we make it not blow up like the last one. And electrification had similar impacts where it changed where you want to put factories, whether you want them to be three-dimensional or this flat 2D sprawling thing. Changed how companies retained their earnings because you could expand more incrementally. And so yeah, just had lots of far-reaching effects. And one of those effects was just, it was actually a better technology. It was a better way to power a factory, better way to move people and goods from one point to another. And so it increased output per hour. Even if you control for population, control for just the amount of physical capital, we still got more out of a given amount of work. And if we don't have new technologies that could be deployed in that way, then we shouldn't really expect those kinds of long-term gains. Now, studying productivity is really, really tricky because productivity is a residual. It is just the error term in a linear regression that says if the economy is made of people and of the things people use to make stuff, then how much more stuff do you get if you add to the number of people or you add to the number of machines? It turns out that is like, if you run those numbers, you have a persistent error term. There's always just more economy than you would think given the inputs. And that more is, we call it productivity growth, but it's really just, it's whatever is changing the economy that we can't measure that increases output over time. And so some of that is going to be the application of new technologies, that the productivity, like the amount of good that can be done, the value of the goods that can be sold starting from 1 ton of steel has gone up over time. We've just learned better things to do with it and more efficient ways to use it. But there are also organizational changes that do improve productivity over time. And so these are things like just coming up with better ways to run companies, better ways to communicate between people, better social norms even can increase productivity. So say a social norm of punctuality is going to increase productivity, because if you don't have that norm, then you know that if a meeting starts at time T, that if you show up 5 minutes late, you're still probably early. So there's this uncertain amount of time to show up. And that means that some people are going to be wasting some of their time. You never know who. If everyone just has a norm of extreme punctuality, then much less time is wasted. So productivity goes up, even though people are doing the same things and the people are the same people. So there are things like that, but also just the fact that when mismanaged firms fail, it's not like all of their assets and employees are just destroyed. Like they're all dispersed. They all get sold to somebody who's going to use that for some other purpose. And you can generally assume that it's almost tautological to assume that more productive managers will be running larger companies, will be the ones buying the assets from the failed companies and will be hiring the employees from those failed companies. So there is this natural drift towards higher productivity, as long as there is such a thing as management skill, or there is such a thing as meaningful differences in corporate culture that can actually lead to better or worse outcome. But some of those can also be over-optimized for particular situations. You have, the CEO who was really, really good at running a scrappy startup and really, really bad at running a multinational corporation, or you have a set of norms where they were really, really good when you were this small oppositional company. Like this happened a lot in crypto. It seems like every successful crypto company has had to have some kind of internal purge where that at some point they take all of the fanatical anarcho-whatevers or people who are trying to destroy central banks. They're like, okay, you guys were really fun to have around for a while. We liked you a lot, but like we talk to people at the Fed. Like we can't be talking about bombing the Fed in the same organization where we're talking to banking regulators. So you have to go do something else. So like I'm not saying that there's just this monotonic increase in the quality of management teams and in the quality of company norm, just that on average, that is part of what's happening. And so that's why you still get some productivity growth, even if there is not some new technology that's being widely deployed. But you will definitely get a lot more of it if you have these new technologies. And the new technologies actually create new kinds of management, new norms for those things. So the transistor has brought us many things, but one of the things that it has made possible is email and Slack and the find a time feature on calendars, which is like, I'm sure that feature alone creates just billions of dollars in productivity because it is so annoying to schedule meetings between lots of different people. It can sometimes be done trivially with a couple clicks. It's amazing. Those kinds of things, like they do in the aggregate show up in productivity numbers, but doing the attribution, figuring out, okay, how much of global GDP is due to the fact that Outlook has a find a time feature and you can use that to figure out when the 4 people on this email thread could get on a call instead or be in the same conference room. Like no one actually knows the numbers. And so no one can directly trace the productivity impact of individual technologies, especially because so much of that impact over time is the compounded effect of these nth order impacts of the fact that we've used this, so it enables this other thing, so it enables this other thing, and this other thing turns out to be really, really good.
That's a good overview. Last question of the day. It's a bit of a bigger one or retro one. In 2020, you did a tweet storm on globalization in response to Venkatesh's tweet storm challenge. And I'm curious where you felt at the time your understanding of globalization kind of differed from Peter Zeihan's view of globalization. And I'm curious if that tweet storm, delivered 4 years later, if there are any major differences or add-ons to it in that we feel like sort of the trajectory has changed at all.
Well, I was going to say it's a cheap shot to ask me about things I tweeted 4 years ago. But of all the times of all the contexts of which someone could say, hey, you know what you tweeted 4 years ago? I'm going to read it aloud to this entire audience. Yeah, this is great. Okay. I love it. Yeah, I think Zeihan, I don't know. I guess Zeihan's deal is that he spent a lot of time looking at the natural resource endowments of different countries and using that to understand a lot of their history, whether that's things like Russia doesn't have a natural border, so of course it's a kind of aggressive military power from time to time, or if that's like America is just, luckiest country on earth in terms of lots of great farmland. We've got lots of oil, we've got iron, we've got copper, we've got uranium, we've got pretty much anything you need, almost everything you need to run a modern industrial economy. So I think that is useful. But I also think there's going to be a cycle to these things, and that you pretty much you want to be aware of that because you're always making decisions in the context of what is everyone else's mental model, and therefore what are they emphasizing. And so there was this. I think there was a lot of hype in the 90s and to some extent in the 2000s about this idea of the world becoming really interconnected and how there's no such thing as having control over strategic resources. You could always just buy them. But this was like a very America-centric view. There's a wonderful little riff on this in The Private Empire about Exxon, where it's talking about American policymakers lecturing the Chinese Communist Party representatives in the early 2000s and telling them, you don't actually need to be doing all of these deals with very repressive third world governments just to get access to cobalt or something. Like, you can buy cobalt. And so your actual strategic decision should be build more factories, make more stuff, sell it to Americans, get nice, green, crisp US dollars, use those to buy the other thing you need. And the Chinese response was basically like, that is really easy to say if you have the world's dominant navy. Like, you can do that, but actually we can only do that if you want us to do that. And so to them, it was basically saying, just surrender, like, become an American vassal state. We will protect you and make sure you have access to the things you need, but they will always be things that you get through us, not things you get on your own. And I think the Americans did not necessarily recognize how much this sounded like a mafia don telling China, nice economy you've got there, be ashamed if anything happened to it. But it's kind of the vibe that I got from trying to imagine that interaction from the Chinese perspective. And so Zion is very much on board with the Chinese perspective here. If you want to build an economy that's dependent on certain inputs, you need to be able to count on those inputs, and you need to do some kind of scenario analysis of, if America doesn't want your country to import oil, or if America does not want your country to export oil, what is your next best option, and is it any good? Is it sustainable? So when Zeihan is in the ascendant, though, you actually want to lean more towards the kind of happy 90s, institutions matter, globalization is inevitable, and incentives mean more than natural resource endowments. So like Zeihan, I think he does talk about Japan, but I think Japan really pushes against his theory, or at least requires more complexity to the theory than my shorthand explanation for it, because Japan just does not have a lot of natural resources. They do have really good institutions, and were able to engineer their economy to grow in manufacturing in a very, very thoughtful and ultimately very profitable way. So that does indicate that, it's not just having a country that is lucky and has natural resources. It's not just your positioning, on the globe, although those things matter. There's also who is in charge, what are their incentives? Are they paid well or promoted when they do X or not? Or do you have some kind of set of institutional and cultural norms where people are going to work pretty hard regardless of the direct rewards they get? So I would actually, I suspect that it is probably a richer vein to mine now, is thinking about institutional quality and thinking about incentive structures and treating global markets like, you shouldn't treat them as a constant, you shouldn't treat them as a given. But if you're thinking about what the optimal policy is for a US aligned country, then it's probably probably treating them as a given is the right approach for a while, and then keeping in mind that they won't be the right approach forever. In fact, if you want to think about another example of a transition there, looking at the history of Singapore as it dealt with the decline of the British Empire is a really good one, because Singapore could have made the same kind of globalization argument of, we don't really need to be able to defend ourselves. Like, we don't need a lot of economic advantages because the British Navy is here. They will keep us safe. Britain does treat us as a friend and strategic partner. And so that's fine. And also the British Navy was a huge fraction of Singapore's GDP when they became independent. But then soon after independence, the British left. They had kind of said they wouldn't, and then they had planned to all along. And the Singaporeans had said, of course, we trust you, and had expected them all along to leave Singapore in the lurch at some point. But it was still a pretty messy situation. Singapore they basically had this off the books account in their sovereign wealth fund that the British did not know about, that was denominating its assets in things other than British pounds, because the Brits wanted, like, part of the British arrangement with a lot of former colonies was, you will continue to get the benefits of being a colony, like being part of the British trade zone and being defended by the British military, but only if you do all of your trade, or as much of your trade as possible, in British pounds, and only if you accumulate lots of British pound reserves. So basically you finance British spending. And that worked for a while, but eventually the colonies were just not financing as much spending as Britain had to do to maintain that system. So it became an unaffordable empire, and they lost it. That could definitely happen to the US. I think it would have to happen in a different technological context. In some ways, empires get much cheaper to maintain when you can use drones to do retaliatory strikes and things. So as long as you have the capacity to manufacture them, there's a lot you can get away with. On the other hand, it's always really hard to tell where the balance between offense and defense is shifting, and also where the balance between number of people and dollar like defense budgets, where that is. And then also hard to figure out the balance of, do you want a lot of people who are kind of on board with your cause or a small number of people who are totally fanatical? Usually when you have a very small number of people who are really, really fanatical, what you get is just terrorist attack. But there's also a range of things where, like Russian military, for example, it's quite numerous, not super well equipped, but it's very unclear if anyone involved is especially on board with continuing to invade Ukraine at this point. I think for a lot of people, it may be more of this calculation of like, it is slightly safer to march forward than to march back, but doesn't seem to be the place where anyone wants to be. So, thinking about how all of those things balance out and how all of those things shift gives me a headache. But what it also reminds me of is that the global order is just a very fragile thing. Like any particular global order, very, very fragile. But the next one is going to look pretty similar to the last one. You'll be able to adapt to it pretty quickly. And, people who started reading The Economist, next year, like they will have a totally different set of assumptions about how the world works than you do, but their assumptions will all be enough to get by.
That is a good note to wrap on. This is a good big idea episode. We covered the future of labor and employment under AI, bullshit jobs, progress, globalization, etymology. Byrne, as always, a great conversation. And until next time.
Thank you. All right. Good.
Thanks for listening to The Riff. Please go follow and subscribe, give us 5 stars, and check out Byrne's excellent newsletter, The Diff, if you haven't already.